I didn't even want to think about doing this cosplay because I knew that wig would be a nightmare. But I kept seeing this Miku everywhere. And of course, I have a horde of red beads. So I was like, okay, I'll just casually start making strawberries. But then in one weekend, I smashed out 50 beaded strawberries. So now I'm committed. This is how I made my Strawberry X Miku cosplay. I still don't know how I'm gonna do that wig. Subscribe to watch me suffer through that. And let's make some skirts. Okay, so there's like 5 elements to this skirt. There's a circle skirt, a high-low skirt with a ruffle, there's a scalloped gingham drape skirt, little white swag, and then a big-ass bow with really big, wide tails. I'm gonna start with the easiest one, the circle skirt. I have already cut out, well, I've done several things, but I have cut out 2 layers for this circle skirt. I have my bridal satin that I am using for basically all of the white on the cosplay, and I have actually elected to use the matte side of the satin. When I got the swatch from Big Z Fabric, it looked like it was gonna be much madder than this, but when seeing it in the yardage, it's a lot shinier than I was expecting, so decided to go with the matte side. And then underneath here, I have also cut out a second layer of stiff net tulle. The reason I have this is to sort of cheat not having a petticoat by kind of having a 1-layer stiff net petticoat going over the hoops, because if we don't have any kind of stiff net over that hoop skirt, you're probably gonna see the hoops. But what I've done to these, they are both cut from the same circle skirt pattern, and they both need to be gathered down. I have already done the gathering stitch on this one, and I actually already gathered down the tulle, but the way I'm gonna do that is I have done a really long basting stitch to both of them. Now I just gotta pull the bobbin thread and gather them up. Also, I have already gone ahead and hemmed this sucker because it is gonna end up pretty gathered, and I figured it would be more annoying to hem it while it was gathered. But I hemmed it with horsehair braid, and I don't know if I will regret that decision, because the last time I did a gathered skirt with horsehair braid, I don't know if it makes it look any prettier or not, but I'm mostly using it as an extra thing to help keep it away from the hoop skirt to help hide the hoops. But once I have both of these gathered, I'm gonna flatline them together at the top, but not install a waistband yet, because my plan is to have every single one of these skirts put into a master waistband, so I don't have to worry about putting 5 skirts on. I also, hopefully, I'm going to have them all be attached with one chunky master zipper that is going to go down the side so that it's underneath the gingham skirt, because then I can just like hook and eye the gingham skirt onto the waistband. So that's that. All right, so as I suspected, I don't like what the horsehair braid is doing. If I like stand here and I like manipulate it, I can get it to like look kind of nice, but for the most part, it just looks stupid. Because the problem with horsehair braid, it wants to be in like this shape, and when it's gathered like that, they're all too close together to really form anything pretty. So lesson learned for the second time, gathers and horsehair braid are not friends. The other thing, the stiff net is, while doing a great job of hiding the hoops with just a single layer of it, them not being gathered together is also causing some problems. So what I think I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take the gathers out of both of them, flatline them together now, and then box pleat them back together as a single unit, and then we should have some like really uniform floopies, which is not what the art looks like, but it will look pretty, so I think I'm gonna do that. Well, that didn't look good either, so the circle skirt got thrown into the angry pile for a bit. But eventually, I ended up doing a bias tape hem on it, and I still didn't like how it looked. So I added a ruffle to it, and this is skipping ahead a little bit, but I had to do that by hand because it was already in the waistband at that point. But that stiff net, I ended up cutting into smaller strips and sewing it directly onto the hoop skirt. Speaking of the hoop skirt, she also did get a little bit of an update. If you missed the video on this hoop skirt, I mentioned that I knew I'd probably end up making changes when heavy things got put on it, and I did. The biggest change I did was I ended up extending the bottom bone. Originally, it was just in this little section at the bottom, but I realized I could take it and feed it through the bias tape that I had on the sides of the other hoops, and by doing that, it floofed out the back a lot more. So that's your hoop skirt update. So moving on to the most complicated skirt, the strawberry music skirt. I do have a little preview though for the music notes. The music notes are strawberries, and I have hand beaded by many little tiny baby strawberries. They took forever. So yeah, the strawberries were the very first thing I made for this cosplay, and they're not hard to make at all. These ones are tiny versions of the ones I made in my strawberry dress video, and that video includes a full tutorial on how to make them, so I won't repeat that here. And you can check that out if you want to make your strawberries this way. Okay, here's the beginnings of this skirt. This one is 3 large panels. One is sort of I think I did like a quarter of a circle skirt for the back, and then these front ones are big swoopy guys that should come all the way up to the front. This one is also getting gathered, but before I can do that, I have an entire music staff to put on this. So what I did already was I marked all the places for the bars. Bitch. Listen, I was in marching band, and I can't remember what the lines of the staff are called. I'm gonna look up what they're called. They're just called lines! Anyway, I actually made myself a little template on a quilting ruler just by putting masking tape on it and marking where each of them needed to go. I also made sure I marked where my seam allowance is so that I have an even spacing between where the seam allowance is and where that first line starts. To do the actual lines, because they are curving with the curve of the skirt, we need something that's going to curve with it. So you really don't want ribbon for this. What you want is bias tape. Here is the sadly messed up roll of bias tape I bought, RIP. But I'm just going to top stitch them down, which is also why I have not sewn this to the lining yet, and this skirt is actually getting fully lined. The reason being because once we sew all this bias tape on, there's gonna be stitch lines all around the back, and it's high-low, so you're gonna see it. So we don't want that. But now I get to start the very long process of sewing this 1/4-inch bias tape down this pretty massive skirt. And I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. I'm just gonna take it, place it where it belongs, and then sew it down on either side of the bias tape. Well, that took 2 days. Time for satin stitching. So I made myself a little guide for this, and what I did was I actually just looked at the little 360 of the art to get an idea of what order the notes were in, and I just put them into a little free like music composing software. It's called MuseScore. It's funny, I actually used to use it when I was like a teenager. I used to try to write music. Anyway, the other cool thing about putting it into that is now we actually get to hear what the song on the skirt sounds like. It does not sound like any Vocaloid song I've ever heard, but if it does sound familiar to you, please let me know in the comments. Anyway, I was laying out where to put the notes, and I was being really hesitant because, listen, I played the trumpet for 8 years of my life, and I know how to read music, and I want it to look as close to real music as supposed to look as possible, but I only made 50 strawberries, and I really don't want to make any more, so they're getting spaced out based on how many strawberries I have, and not based on where the notes would really be placed evenly. So that means some of the 8th notes are pretty far away from each other, which is fine. Because I mean, the art doesn't even have bars on it. Like, there's no measures to be seen. What I ended up doing was putting pins in the fabric to make sure I knew I could fit my number of strawberries into the sections. And then once I had the pins spaced out, I went through and I marked with heat erase pen where the notes are actually going. The way I'm doing both the lines of the notes and the top sections of the notes, don't fault me for not knowing what that's called anymore. I'm doing in satin stitching. If you don't know what satin stitching is, here's your rerun. So your sewing machine has 2 settings for zigzag stitches: stitch width and stitch length. Stitch width decides how wide the zigzag will be, while stitch length decides how close together each stitch will be. If you turn your stitch length down low enough, it starts to form a solid line, which we call a satin stitch. Now, some machines have a specific stitch that is a satin stitch, and my grandmother's faff here happens to have one, and it's gorgeous. and it looks a lot better than the very tight zigzag stitch on my brother machine. But I did still have to play with the settings. These are the settings I'm using. This machine is a little unique in that it can go up to a 10mm stitch width, which is so cool. And when I told my boyfriend how cool it was, he had no idea what I was talking about. But I'm also using some tearaway stabilizer on the back of all of the music notes to make sure the satin stitching looks nice. And after a couple days of satin stitching, a couple notes at a time, I could move on to the little leaves, which are actually just also a decorative stitch that the faff has. We're all gonna say thank you, Grandma. If you don't say thank you, Grandma, then get out. But those also got the tearaway stabilizer because they also need it. And if you don't have a machine that can do this kind of stitch, there are plenty of lace options out there that either are straight up leaves or look like leaves that you could use instead. So the satin stitching's done, the leaves are done, but I have not put the strawberries on yet because I do not want them to get in the way of getting the ruffle on here. And that's what I'm gonna do next. So for the ruffle, so in the art, the ruffle starts small in the front and then graduates to much longer in the back. You could say it crescendos. So I've done some weird stuff to achieve that. Essentially, I cut a bunch of strips at these measurements. So they started at 6 inches and they ended up at 16 inches, and it goes from small to big to then small again. So I cut 2 of each and then sewed them together with the largest ones in the middle and then gradating out to the smallest ones at the edges. And that all got folded and pressed, and then I serged them, and that's where we are now. So I have a big long strip of fabric that starts at 3 inches and ends up at 8 inches. And if I have done my math right, and it's entirely possible that I did not, but if I did my math right, I need to take each 58-inch section and I need to take them down to 18 inches. But unfortunately, I have decided to do the entire ruffle by hand because the 2 layers of dull bridal satin with machine stitching was not working. It's just too thick at this point, and that's gonna take forever. I'm gonna pin this on first, and then I'm gonna baste it on by machine, which probably break a couple needles because it's a pretty thick ruffle. But once that's on, I do actually have one more step before I can put the lining onto this, because we're doing some weird shit with the lining, because the lining is actually how I'm gonna hide the bottom of the hoop skirt. So right now the lining is just cut the same way that the outer skirt is cut, but I have a couple weird plans for it. Okay, Bill wouldn't stop crying, so she's here now. So the first time I did a hidden hoop skirt, it was for my Garuka cosplay, and that one was really different. Okay, Bill. It was like an elliptical design where all the hoops were sewn into one little packet at the front that then buckled, but that one was actually sewn into the skirt. Okay, you can't do that. And we can't do that this time. For one, I want it to be removable for storage, but 2, we really can't do it because the circle skirt peeks out from below the note skirt. So we need the hoop in the front to be free, but then hidden in the back. So what I've done is I took my mock-up and I put it on my hoop skirt, and then I marked on the mock-up where those lowest hoops were starting, as well as how far out they go. Then I just cut that section out of my mock-up, pinned it to the hoop skirt to see if it was working. So now I can use my mock-up as a pattern for the lining, which is kind of nerve-wracking. But I'm gonna do a couple things. Once I get that cutout on, I'm gonna seal that cutout with bias tape, and then I'm gonna put Velcro across the top edge of it and put corresponding Velcro in by hand into the hoop skirt. With the lining altered, I basted the ruffle to the outer layer before sewing it right sides together with the lining, and with that, I was ready to finally add all of my hand beaded strawberries and all these little daisies that I made. And those are all just getting put on by hand. Next we have the Gingham Skirt, aka the best skirt. Gingham is the best pattern, and you can't change my mind on that. This one is scalloped on the edges, but it also has some bias tape running through it that correspond to the scallops. So that one is going to work exactly the same way as the large skirt. However, we do have corners to worry about with this one. Okay, so this is actually kind of really hard. I'm gonna start by showing you how to do the corner, and then I'm gonna talk about how to get the bias tape going into that curve, because it is easy to get it looking really ugly, but there are a couple things that I'm doing that are making it easier. But I will say I am glad I started on the back. So for the corner, what I'm doing is, so here's my bias tape. I'm taking it and I am folding it over like that, so it ends up in a nice little corner. And the way I'm doing the curve is I'm starting with the lower part of the bias tape, and that is important. Once I get it into that fold, I'm gonna start at the corner and I'm gonna start sewing downward, but I'm gonna stop periodically because a thing that helps this not be ugly is to keep the bias tape nice and taut on this lower edge. So I'm pulling it a little bit and then I'm placing it down along that curve. And then with it still held really taut, I'm going around the bottom of it along that curve. And you gotta keep it taut the whole time you go around the bottom. So then when I get to the other corner, I'm gonna sew up basically to where the point is gonna be. And I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna go back to the start and I'm gonna do the other side. And you really wanna do this really carefully because this is a part that's gonna get ugly if you're not careful. So I'm gonna come back down and I'm gonna make sure everything is staying flat. You don't want any puckers. So if you start to see a pucker forming, stop and pick your foot up and make sure that pucker does not happen. And holding it taut on the first pass is really what helps the puckers not happen. I don't know why, but that is what's helping me. And then I sew on this side up to the point and I stop again. I do our little fold again and we go to the next one. Well, that was hard, but the good news is the actual scallops are not that hard at all, especially when they're this big. What I have done is I pinned together my 2 layers, right sides together, and I took my pattern and I went around and I marked where all the scallops are. So now all we have to do is follow this line with a straight stitch on the sewing machine, making sure that we get a really nice curve. Now with tinier scallops, it can be kind of hard to really get a nice curve in there because if you stop at any point, when you turn the scallop out, you might notice that it's a little bit pointy. But with big scallops, it's so much easier because you have so much more room to get a really nice clean curve in there. The other thing with scallops is you never want to go more than 50% of a circle. You really want to stay within the like 30 to 40% range, if not less, because the shallower it is, the easier it is for that fabric to get into that shape. So now that the stitches are in, I'm just going to go through and I'm going to clip all of the edges up to the points. And you want to be really careful not to cut your stitch line. So now that those are clipped, I'm going to get my pinking shears. And if you don't know, pinking shears are scissors that create a zigzag cut. The actual purpose of pinking shears is that when you cut fabric with a zigzag like this, it makes it harder for the fibers to fray away from each other. But in this case, we're using it as a shortcut so that we don't have to cut a ton of little notches all the way around all of the scallops, which you could just do if you don't have pinking shears. So I'm just gonna carefully go around every single one of these. And I'm gonna cut pretty close to that stitch line, but you obviously wanna be careful not to cut it. So now that that's clipped, we can turn this thing inside out, gently push the curves out with a crochet hook or the end of a paintbrush. Gently, we don't wanna break them. Then we can press the whole thing flat and our scallops are done. So, the last thing I gotta do to this one is this skirt actually has little bows that go along all these little points. I just made these in the same bias tape. I'll show you how I do it. You just take it and you make a little loop and then you bring that loop down to the cross. And then I was sewing them down by machine and then adding the little bow knot by hand. But I waited until this point to put them on because if I had already sewn them in, they would have gotten in the way of my scallops. But I can still get my hand in here. So I am still going to be able to sew them in just on this one side so that we don't see anything on the back. So I got to do all that by hand. But when I'm done with that, the gingham skirt, aka the best skirt, will be done. Finally, we have the white swag. I just cut it like this, and what's gonna happen to it is pretty simple. This piece is not getting lined. I'm going to finish it on the top and bottom with bias tape, and the reason I wanna finish these edges with bias tape is because I want to fold them over, but also I can't really put a pocket in our big skirt because this skirt and the gingham skirt are going over top of it. But because this sits on top and because it's poofy and because this is open, I'm probably gonna be able to get my hand in there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a little bag to go under this thing so that way I can slip my hand in, grab my stuff, and be able to take it out. So this is actually going to be our secret pocket. And then I'm going to serge these 2 edges, gather up these 2 edges, And then hopefully these edges will go into the master waistband. Okay, so the strawberries are all on. The daisies are all on. The ruffle's in, the lining's in, the flounce is made. The gingham's done. I gotta admit, I'm not super happy with the ruffle. Kind of think I overdid it. I don't think I needed that much ruffle, but it is what it is. So my goal now is to get all of these skirts into a single waistband. So what I already did, I have taken the circle skirt and the note skirt and I sewed them together by hand, kind of loosely, because I am going to go over it with machine. I have also prepared the spot for the zipper. So before the waistband goes in, I need to put the zipper in here, but the zipper will go through both the circle skirt and the note skirt. And then the flounce over here is just pinned, but it's going to get sewn into the waistband too, just at the tops there. The pocket is in there, and then the gingham skirt is going to get sewn into the waistband in the front, but in the back, where the bias tape is, it's going to be free so that it can fold over and like hook an eye in the back. And so it'll look like that. Because the zipper and the waistband are not in, it's not sitting quite right on the dress form. And the bottom is just hanging free right now because I haven't put the Velcro on the inside of the hoop skirt. And I will probably make some adjustments to the hoop skirt to make it sit a little better, but that's where we are. It's not looking great right now, but hopefully when everything is done, she'll look a little better. She just looks disheveled, honestly. The ruffle is just too much and she looks very disheveled. Okay, so I actually made 2 mistakes with this ruffle. First of all, it was overcalculated. When you make a ruffle, you take the length of the section that you need to fill and you give it a multiplier. Well, the multiplier I went with was kind of just whatever was easy enough for me to figure out for doing the changing lengths of that ruffle. But when calculated, it was 3.2, and that was just way too much. 2.5 is the gold standard, and that's what I should have gone with. But the second mistake has to do with how satin is made. If you caught the fabric video, you probably already know that satin is not a fabric, it's a weave. And to understand the mistake, I really need to explain grain and cross grain and how they relate to satin. So the grain is the fibers that run parallel to the selvage, and the cross grain are the fibers that run perpendicular. The way I remember this is that cross grain crosses over the selvage. Anyway, with satin's particular weave, the threads of the grain are caught and looped by the cross grain only at certain intervals. Basically, that means that some of those threads are coming up and skipping over several of the threads underneath them, and then they go back in. That's what makes it shiny. But when you fold those threads that are skipping over, it kind of kinks. It doesn't sit right, because now you've got all those threads underneath them interfering with the fold. And that is what I did to this ruffle. I folded them on those threads, on the cross grain. So the bottom of it looks really weird. But if I had folded with those threads, if you fold with the grain, it comes out much cleaner. Because now those long threads can go on either side of that fold. The best way I can describe it is it's kind of like cardboard. You know how you can only fold cardboard in one way? That's satin. I'm hoping when everything is actually in the right place that she'll look okay, but yeah, that's her for now. So to start, I'm gonna do a machine stitch to kind of hold everything together. Then I'm gonna install the zipper, and then I'm gonna put the waistband on, and I'm gonna do that by putting it right sides together with the skirts, folding it over, flipping over the edge, and then I'm probably just gonna sew that in by hand too. But she's almost done. Hopefully she'll look better when she's actually done. So these big pleated bowtails. There's a bunch of details on these. They have an extra strip of dark pink on the edge. There's some lace going over that. There's polka dots, and then it's pleated and like defies gravity. So I could not find a dark pink microsuede that I liked, but I still had this pink Dynaflow that I bought years ago for pink diamond, and I still had it. So that's what I ended up using for the dark pink edge. I watered it down a little bit and I painted on that dark pink. For the actual ruffle, it's going to be 3 layers. So there's going to be stiff net in the middle to help the shape, and then microsuede on the top with a poly cotton lining. For this lace, I did a lot of searching to find a cotton eyelet lace that looked anything close to the art, and this is not a perfect match, but I think it's fine. And the polka dots are actually just cut up pieces of another lace. So all the polka dots and lace are getting pinned on with the stiff net under it, so that when they all get sewn on, the stiff net gets sewn to the underside of the microswave. I sewed on all the dots, which, yeah, it's really annoying to sew things in a little tiny circle. But before I added the lace, I pinned some horsehair braid under it so that it will get sewn in at the same time as the lace. With that all together, I added the lining by putting them right sides together and sewing around all the edges. I clipped the corners, turned it right side out, gave it a good press, and gave it 3 pleats at the top. And the big ass bow tails were done. Now, I've been kind of upset with how a lot of this skirt has turned out, but these 2 pink polka dot pleats, I feel like I nailed these. Finally, the actual bow on the butt. So this lace is a cotton eyelet ribbon lace, and finding ribbon lace this wide was actually like really hard. I ended up finding it on eBay, and it's actually a vintage lace, which is unfortunate because it means the listing will run out eventually, but the search term you're going to want is cotton ribbon eyelet wide. Anyway, I ribboned up the ribbon lace and basted it into the loops of the bows. These are loop bows, by the way, and if you've never made a loop bow over a square bow, I can't recommend them enough. They come out looking so much fancier than a square bow. To save on fabric and on weight, the outside of the bows is microsuede, but the inside of the loops is just cotton. And I did the same for the tails as well. With those sewn to their linings, I turned them right side out, pressed them, folded the 2 halves of my loops, sewed them together, sewed the tails to the back of the bow, added the white ruffle, and I do have a new tip for bow knots. If you put a tiny bit of horsehair braid in there, it comes out so poofy and nice and clean. You gotta try it. It looks great. Oh, and the back bow also has a quadruple loop pink bow behind it, and that's just made the same way as the other bow, but there's 4 of them, and those all got sewn onto the back of the bow before all of that got sewn onto the back of the dress. And normally I make bows removable with a brooch clip, but then I never remove them, so I just sewed them all on this time. And with that, Miku's skirts were finally done. Well, so after Dragon Con, I came back and I realized I hated the ruffle. So I unpicked it up in the front here to make it a little less disheveled, and I'm still not super happy with it, but it's better. It's just really disappointing to feel like I messed up the basics, you know? I know how to make a ruffle, and I knew that thing about satin folding that way, but you use a lot less fabric when you cut it on the cross grain, so the big problem here is this just should have been cotton to begin with, but I didn't want to deal with any of the wrinkling, so this is what we get. But I mean, so what if the ruffle didn't come out as clean as I wanted? The music staff looks great. There's a ton of sparkle from the strawberries, and like the back is like perfect. I fucked up this ruffle, but I'm not gonna let that ruin enjoying the rest of the work that went into this cosplay. I'm never gonna get everything right 100% of the time, so I'm just gonna take solace in that some of it looks really great. Next time I see you, I will be working on the blouse, so make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if you liked the video, please break a needle on that like button for me, and maybe even leave a comment, because those things tell the YouTube robot that it should show the video to other people. And like, this is a pretty small channel, so it really, really does help. So please actually like the video. Speaking of, thank you very much for 4,000 subscribers. I see every single one of y'all's comments, and I cannot thank you enough for being here. I've had people tell me they listen to me while they work on their own cosplay, so if you got something done while this was playing, please let me know. And a big thank you to my big support tier patrons: Pins, Snip, Claire, Amory, Messy, Reiko, and Samina. It's getting harder to remember all your names, but that's a good problem to have. If you want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon, but if you're liking, commenting, subscribing, or just watching, you're supporting the channel too. Bye! Ow. I hit my head.